Good afternoon or good morning to some of you. This is Jeremy Dawson from the NAST headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Debt Management Important Regulation Updates. The comment letter and slides that we are discussing are available for your reference in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar platform and will be available along with the recording and the webinar archive of the NAST and SDMN sites. Please note that you are free to submit questions electronically via the webinar platform during the presentation. These will be addressed by the facilitator during today's webinar. To electronically submit your questions, simply type them into the questions dialog box on the GoToWebinar application. On behalf of NAST and SDMN, I would like to welcome and thank our speakers for presenting to our membership today. And Mr. Erdman, at this point, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everybody for your time this afternoon in this State Debt Management Network webinar entitled Important Regulation Updates. This webinar is going to be a little different from past webinars in the sense that we are going to address two current regulation matters that all issuers should be aware of. If needed at a later time, we'll go through a more detailed webinar on these matters, as they get finalized and as, more importantly, issuers start to understand and practice the new regulations. The two topics we're going to talk today about are amendments to Rule 15C 212 and the new issue price regulations that the service has released and that go effective on June 7th. To begin with, I want to welcome and thank Joel Oswald and Rebecca Kahns from the firm of Williams & Jensen. They will be presenting information about the proposed amendments to Rule 15C 212. Joel is a principal at the law and lobbying firm of Williams & Jensen, who specializes in legislative and regulatory practices on financial services policy. Joel has 17 years of public and private sector service and works with clients on a range of legislative and regulatory policy issues, including securities, banking, and consumer finance. Rebecca joined Williams & Jensen in 2008 as a legislative analyst before becoming government relations manager at the firm. Ms. Kahns focuses on legislative and regulatory practices related to financial services policy and on issues such as equity market structure, the Dodd-Frank Act, securities, and banking. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Rebecca to start the discussion on the proposed amendments to Rule 15C 212.
Okay, so the SEC voted on March 1st to amend Rule 15C 212 to increase the types of disclosures provided to investors. The proposed amendments would add two new events to the list of notices that a participating underwriter must reasonably determine that an issuer or obligated person has agreed to provide to the MSRB in its continuing disclosure agreement. Can we forward to the next slide? There we go. The additional events reflect on the creditworthiness of the issuer or obligated person and the terms of the securities they issue. The two new events are incurrence of a financial obligation of the obligated person if material, or agreement to covenants, events of default, remedies, priority rights, or other similar terms of a financial obligation of the obligated person, any of which affect security holders if material. And two, default event of acceleration, termination event, modification of terms, or other similar events under the terms of a financial obligation of the obligated person, any of which reflects financial difficulties. In the proposed amendments, the term financial obligation is defined as 1, a debt obligation, 2, a lease, 3, a guarantee, 4, a derivative instrument, or 5, monetary obligation resulting from a judicial, administrative, or arbitration proceeding. The term financial obligation shall not include municipal securities, which a final official statement has been provided to the MSRB consistent with this rule. Materiality determination under the proposal applies to the incurrence of the financial obligation in each of the terms laid out in the new events, i.e., meaning the covenants, events of default, remedies, priority rights, or other similar terms. While materiality is not clearly defined, the SEC does provide a few examples that relate to the amount of the obligation, meaning that for a $1 million issuer, a $20,000 obligation will not be considered material. Another example is an obligation that doesn't actually impact the priority rights related to the debt instrument. The concern is that the material financial obligation could result in a contingent liquidity and credit risk, refinancing risk, and reduced security for existing security holders. Under the proposed rule, the SEC does request some comment directly about the materiality standard. For example, they ask whether the materiality conditions are appropriate conditions, or whether all of the new events and the subjects under the new events should be subject to materiality condition. Rule 15C212 applies to dealers acting as underwriters in primary offerings with an aggregate principal amount of $1 million or more, and prohibits the purchase of or sale of municipal securities in connection with an offering unless the participating underwriter has determined that the issuer has undertaken in a written agreement or contract to provide the MSRB within 10 days of occurrence of one of these listed events. Underwriters usually comply with this by requiring the issuer of the municipal securities to undertake in a written agreement to provide these event notices, and dealers usually comply with this by ensuring they have procedures in place requiring their registered representatives or those who are recommending the municipal securities to have access to the MSRB's EMMA system. The proposed amendments were published in the Federal Register on March 15th, and comments are due by May 15th, which is coming up. The proposal notes that if adopted, the SEC would prefer to implement these amendments quickly and have suggested a possible 3-month compliance date after final implementation.
Okay, this is Joel, and I'll go on to the next slide. Want to talk about some of the, Rebecca gave kind of a high-level overview of the proposed amendments. I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons that the SEC states that they are proposing these amendments. I'll also kind of wrap up highlighting a few of the comment letters, and then we can open it up to some questions. Some of the rationales that were given in the proposing release, you know, they talk a little bit about some of the market developments, and including the growth of the municipal securities markets, but really a lot of it boils down to the, they say market participants, they don't always have this timely access to financial statements of issuers. So in case one of these types of events occurs, which Rebecca outlined, to the extent that happens, they're not always fully informed in a timely fashion. You know, they talk about, in there they mention MSRB and certain market participants raising concerns about the lack of secondary market disclosure regarding these financial obligations. They also talk about kind of the increase that some of the issuers and obligated persons have used some of these direct placements as alternatives to public offerings of municipal securities. They cite kind of that trend starting in 2009, which was kind of a little after the financial crisis started, as I'm sure everyone remembers. And then they also discuss kind of the limited voluntary disclosures. MSRB kind of highlights this. I'll get to their comment letter in just a little bit, but they, the SEC references kind of the continued efforts by just MSRB, but other market participants to have some type of voluntary disclosure. But MSRB has stated that the number of actual disclosures is, quote, limited. I'm not sure what they, how much that is in a quantitative sense, but they say that's limited. So maybe on to the next slide, I can go into a little bit of detail on MSRB's comment letter, which actually isn't very long, but they kind of go through their history of trying to increase disclosures around these types of events. And this goes back several years. You know, they have expressed interest in increasing use by municipal entities of the bank loans and direct purchases and other forms of indebtedness in lieu of, public issuance of municipal securities, and that they have urged this voluntary disclosure of these types of financings. And the reason, because they say they don't have the same type of disclosure as the public offerings would have. They note that what they have done in order to facilitate more disclosure is providing some guidance back in 2012 on how to make a voluntary disclosure through EMA. And then more recently, they describe that last September, in September 2016, they made enhancements to EMA to facilitate this. So they're asserting that it's an improved process to make these voluntary disclosures, so improved for issuers to actually do that, and also easier for investors of all types to actually find and retrieve that information. So the MSRB just kind of concludes that, hey, we've done all this work, but there has been kind of, they still believe an actual rule by the SEC is the best approach. They also actually comment on the concept proposal that they issued last year on whether municipal advisors should be required to disclose more information about bank loans. And they mentioned that a lot of commenters didn't believe MSRB was the proper venue through MSRB rulemaking, but instead that these kind of special event notice provisions should be, that the SEC should kind of move forward because Rule 15C212 provides that framework already, so just enhancing that rule would be a better approach according to some of the commenters. So in sum, that's kind of where MSRB is. They support the SEC's proposal. A couple others I wanted to highlight. One is the bond lawyers, National Association of Bond Lawyers. They actually provide a lot of information. I'm not going to go through it all, but they expressed a lot of concern about the Commission's estimates for the burdens of complying with the collection of this new information. They think the SEC greatly underestimated the actual burdens that these amendments would impose. In fact, they state that the actual burdens are more than 100 times those estimated by the Commission. And then they have an attachment which, based on interviews and surveys, they come up with their own estimate. They do intend, it appears, to write, that they intend to write another comment letter, probably touching more on some of the substantive matters instead of just focusing on the costs entailed. They probably would also include that along with some costs along with recommendations. But that's kind of where they're coming from. And then one other I just will highlight, there obviously were more comment letters, but I just picked out some of the, what I'd say, key ones filed thus far. Obviously more will be coming in the next couple weeks. But this is from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and they express a lot of concern about what is an obligation and what is material. So trying to get more clarity into those definition as to particularly what constitutes materiality. And their concern is that everyone will err on the side of disclosing everything, whether it's material or not, which would increase costs even further. So I guess that's where I'll wrap it up. And we can go to, I guess, Dave, or questions, or however you want to see.
Yeah, thanks, Jill and Rebecca. I guess, again, Jeremy, if you want to highlight, if people have questions, the process they should go through in order to raise questions.
Absolutely. There's a questions dialog box that should be appearing in the GoToWebinar application. If you can just type those questions in, they'll be electronically submitted to us, and we will forward those on to the moderator.
Okay, thank you. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to use that process. Before we start the discussion on the new issue price regulations, I do want to take a couple seconds to highlight what the State Debt Management Network and NAST has been doing with respect to comment on these proposed amendments. The State Debt Management Network Executive Board has reviewed a letter that's been drafted by NAST. We have approved it. It is currently being reviewed by others at NAST. In this letter, 3 concerns have been raised. One about the broad definition of financial obligations, and from a state issuer's perspective, you use an extreme situation. Is a purchase order that I issue for pencils, is that a financial obligation? So just looking for some more guidance as to what the definition of financial obligations is. Second concern that's being raised is the lack of SEC guidance in standards for determining materiality. And the third concern that's being raised is just the difficulties and costs that states will have to administer these changes to these proposed amendments to the rule, and whether those costs that the states will have to bear will be worth it with respect to the increased or improved disclosure that the market might receive. That's just a summary of the letter. Preston, if you want to go through any more details as to the letter and how we access it on the webinar here, and then furthermore what the plans are for finalizing that letter.
Sure, Dave, thanks. Yes, in the handouts portion of your dialog box in the webinar, you can view the 15C212 comment letter that NAST is considering right now. As Dave mentioned, it has been approved by the State Debt Management Board and is currently under review by the NAST Executive Committee. So if anyone out there, any issuer or state treasurer would like to submit additional comments or concerns, please let me know. My email is preston@statetreasurers.org. And you can view that letter there. It may change a little bit before it is filed, but it is there in case you would like to formulate your own comments to the SEC or pull from this resource as you move forward with your office business there. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Preston. And with respect to comments on these proposed amendments to the rule, other organizations beyond those mentioned in the presentation and beyond NAST, GFOA, other organizations are also planning on submitting comment letters by the May 15th deadline. Individual issuers are encouraged also to submit comment letters and could mirror the concerns that are raised on these letters that are being drafted by the organizations. But the key thing to get across to participants in today's webinar is that the due date for those comments is May 15th. So, not seeing any questions on that, we will then move to the next part of the webinar to talk about the new issue price regulations that are going to effect on June 7th of this year. So the next page of the webinar has the agenda of things that I'm going to address, just a history of the issue price matter, summary of the new rules, highlight some items that state level issuers should be interested in, and provide some resources to provide more information on information that's out there about these new issue price rules. At the bottom of the page is probably the primary goal of the webinar, is that this is a new regulation. While it was announced back in late December, it doesn't go into effect until June 7th. But now is the time to start having all issuers discuss the components of this rule with their bond counsel, tax counsel, advisors, and other finance team members, just to see how they're going to address and comply with the rule. There are some positives, there are some negatives of the rule. So having a discussion now before you schedule a bond sale that happens on or after June 7th is a key step. So next slide, I start talking about just the history of the issue price. And I think all issuers are aware of the issue price matter. The issue price is utilized for many aspects of public finance, to determine the arbitrage yield for purposes of rebate determinations, to determine what there might be a limit on for escrow yield for advanced refining transactions, determine the amount of proceeds. It's used for volume caps and cost of issuance determinations. The issue price is an important item that's used in all aspects of our business. The current regulations basically include some reasonable expectations as what that issue price is. Many issuers will sign a certificate saying that or many issuers will receive from underwriters a issue price certificate that talks about that reasonable expectations. And furthermore, based upon past determinations, there's been a standard that 10% of bonds being sold to the public helps establish that reasonable expectation. And on slide 7 here is just some language that I've pulled from different issue price certificates that I've signed over the past couple of years that highlights again that reasonable expectations test of the issue price. The IRS or the service, or however I want to refer to them, has had concerns of issue price for many years. And the next slide starts to talk about some of the more recent history. I think the service and speeches at conferences or in comments that made the press started raising concerns about how the issue price was determined all the way back to probably 2010, 2011. But more importantly, in 2013, they actually issued the first proposed rules to change the issue price, where they were going to raise that reasonable expectation to actual sales, and the substantial threshold would change from 10% to 25%. That was met with immediate reactions from not only the issuer community but the underwriting community. It caused some issuers to really track what their secondary trade levels were to make sure that they really knew what the price was of their bonds that were being sold. I think it was from these proposed rules in 2013 that you actually saw the MSRB EMMA system expand to include the real-time trading information that's available on EMMA, as a result of some of these rules that came out in 2013. In 2015, the service revised their proposed rules and put those out. Went back to a 10% threshold of bonds actually sold to the public, but included more responsibilities on the underwriting community as to what they'd have to certify and document with respect to that. That was met with some opposition from underwriters. Based upon those comments, next slide goes into a little bit of summary as to the issue price rules that were released in December of 2016, and were published and will be effective on June 7th of 2017. The important part about these issue price rules is that they include some new requirements, in the sense that the issue price is based upon the substantial amount of each maturity that is actually sold to the public, and uses a 10% threshold for that. But furthermore, the new issue price rules include some new exceptions, which we'll go over later in this presentation. The other positive of the new issue price rules is that it clarified the definitions of public and underwriter, as those terms have been used in the past. For example, public now could be an underwriter who isn't in the syndicate. So if you have a competitive sale and there's a syndicate that helps the sale of the bonds, or if you do a negotiated sale and you have a syndicate that's set up, or a selling group set up, if there's an underwriter who's not in that group, there could be a sale of the bonds to them, and they would meet the definitions of public to help meet the requirements of this regulation. The link that's provided on slide 9 is actually a link to the actual regulations that were published. If you're interested in seeing those, that would be the link that would take you to those regulations. Just before we go into some more details here, I mentioned the service have been looking at issue price since 2009, 2010. The concern was that the service was seeing a lot of bonds that were being sold and immediately flipped, through flippers or arbor accounts or trading accounts, and there were some big deviations between the initial offering price that the issuers had at the primary market and what happened, within hours, within days after the bonds were free to trade. And it was that activity that the service really noticed and took action. And the intent here is to develop some new issue price rules that address that in part, and hopefully to the benefit of issuers, underwriters, and everyone else. So, moving on to the next slide. I mentioned there's 2 major exceptions to the issue price rule that goes into effect on June 7th. The first exception that's built into the rule is for competitive sales. The issue price for competitive sales can be based on initial offering price of the winning bid in competitive sales, provided that 4 different criteria are met. The concern from an issuer's perspective is when these rules were drafted is that in a competitive sale environment, we really don't have control over as to where our bonds are sold or how our bonds are sold. We receive a competitive bid from an underwriter, and where those bonds are placed after that competitive bid process truly is up to the winning bidder in the market, and there really isn't much that the issuer can do. So we really couldn't control the process that's needed in order to determine that 10% threshold that's in the rule. The service feels they did the issuing community a good service by including this competitive sale exception. I think for large state-level issuers, this is probably a good exception, but we'll talk about some concerns about it a little bit later. But the criteria for meeting the competitive sale exception is that you need to have a notice of sale that's widely available. You need to provide equal opportunity for everyone to bid on those bonds. The most important aspect of it is that you must receive at least 3 bids from underwriters. And based upon a SIFMA conversation or webinar that happened just this week, John Cross from the service alluded to that it's possible that even a bid from a bank could count against those 3 bids that are received from underwriters, although bank and underwriting is considered to be different definitions in the rule. And then the final criteria in order to claim this competitive sale exception is that you need to award the sale to the bidder at the highest price or the lowest cost of funds. And I believe as long as you're consistent with a TIC or NIC calculation, you're awarding it consistently upon that, that would meet the criteria here for the fourth test of the competitive sales. So that was the first exception. The other exception is called hold the price. And from an issuer's perspective, this is an exception that shouldn't be used. Hold the price essentially requires that the underwriters and the issuers agree that the underwriter will hold the price, the initial offering price, for 5 days or until 10% of the bonds are sold. That induces market risk to the underwriter, and the underwriter is not going to pay for that. So it's truly expected that underwriters, if they need to hold the price, they will build that into their spread. So to the extent this exception is pursued or mentioned or even contemplated, issuers would be paying a higher cost of funds. So as issuers discuss this new rule with their advisors, with their counsels, and with members of the finance team, they should be looking at ways to comply with the rule other than pursuing the hold the price. That all said, there may be transactions where hold the price is the way that has to be, is the route that has to be complied with in order to meet the issue price rule. And if that's the case, that's just going to be a cost of meeting the requirements of the rule. Next slide just goes over some implementation considerations. Since the rule was released in early December of 2016, major groups, GFOAs, SIFMA, NABL, and others have been discussing, how to implement the rule. Different organizations such as SIFA, NABL, and others have developed standard forms of documents. Generally, this is an evolving process, and the documents and the process will evolve, as parties start to implement the rule and understand, how it's met and how it needs to be interpreted. We don't expect any more guidance from the service on this rule. As for documents that will be impacted as issuers and participants move forward in implementing the rule, for negotiated sales, there's going to be language probably added to the agreement among underwriters in the bond purchase agreement. And furthermore, there will still be the issue price certification. With respect to competitive sales, first let me talk about the issue price certification. The past issue price certification of a page is probably a thing of the past. The last page has a resource as to NABL has put out some draft forms of the issue price certification. There is going to be more documentation that's going to be needed in order to back up the certifications that are made with respect to issue price. So all issuers should be aware of that. With respect to competitive sales, the notice of sale is the key document for all issuers on a competitive sale front. And SIFMA actually has put together some riders or some alternatives for language in the notice of sale that would address the rule or the exceptions that are available to the rule. In short, these 4 alternatives include, first off, one, just generally meeting the general intent of the rule, that whenever 10% of each maturity is sold, that's going to be the issue price for each maturity. And if that doesn't occur on the day of the sale, we'll require that the underwriters report when the sale occurs, and we'll determine the issue price at that time. That's the first alternative. Second alternative uses that hold the price exception, which I indicated should be steered away from. But again, there may be situations where that is the only route that's going to be available to issuers to use to meet the issue price rule regulations. So provisions of that alternative will outline that underwriters should take into account when they submit their competitive bid that there may be a hold the price requirement. The third alternative that SIFMA has developed has similar to the second alternative, pursues the hold the price alternative, but allows for some cancellation to occur if the hold the price has to be used. It should be noted that when SIFMA first put out their draft documents back in March, a process of the underwriters revoking their bid was introduced, but in response to the SIFMA documents, the issuers group have fought against that. And then the final alternative from SIFMA is simply that, if an issuer does a competitive sale and for some reason doesn't meet the exceptions that are provided, they have the right to cancel the sale, similar to how issuers may have that right already in their notice of sale documentation. So that's a quick summary of the documentation aspects for implementing the new rule. The other thing that issuers should be aware of, and the reason for this webinar now a month prior to June 7th, is that with the June 7th effective date, issuers may want to take that into account as they schedule the timing of their next bond issue. Based upon conversations that I and others have had with market participants, especially underwriters, it seems like there's still a lot of training that has to be done to bring people up to speed as to the details of complying with this rule. And to the extent that you could sell some bonds on June 6th rather than June 7th, that might just be an easier process and less headaches for an issuer. That's something else to take into mind as you move forward on the calendar. The next slide starts to highlight just some general points of interest that state-level issuers should be aware of. First off, as I mentioned up front in the agenda, that the reason for this webinar is to bring this to everyone's attention to make sure they're aware of it, encourage all issuers to start discussions with their finance team and how they're going to comply with the issue price rules. Secondly, with respect to competitive sale requirements, all state laws are different as to when a competitive sale requirement is, when a competitive sale is required, or when an issuer has an option to use competitive or negotiated sale. Well, some of the exceptions and some of the discussions on this new issue price rule have been in the area of competitive sales. People should be aware that the new issue price rules, or the general rule, applies to all bond issues, negotiated or competitive. So just by going the negotiated route doesn't mean you're hiding from this new rule. It's just that you're going to have to meet the general intents of the rule or rely on other exceptions that are out there besides the competitive sale exception. There is some provisions in the general rule or in the issue price rules for bank loans that address specifically how the issue price is determined for bank loans. For state-level issuers, we probably have the expertise, staffing, and contractual services that allow for us to comply with the issue price rules. I mentioned before, if the 10% standard of bonds being sold at each maturity isn't met on the sale date, we probably have the resources and the abilities to, wait for the underwriter to sell, up to 10% of that maturity to the public. And, it's been discussed with many people that, depending upon the requirements of the issuer or requirements of the issue, the issue price may not be determined until after the closing. It may be, after the closing, weeks after the closing before the issue price is determined. Obviously, there's certain documentation that goes with every bond issue that still has to be completed, such as the 8038G and other documents. So not saying that issuers should not follow the practice for completing documents, but just that the issue price may not be determined until a later time. The next slide continues points of interest for state-level issuers. One item that I don't have on here, but I do want to mention before I go into these items here, is that with this new rule, especially around June 7th or probably for a few months after June 7th, it's expected that underwriters are going to probably need some more time to read the documents, especially competitive sale documents, to see what provisions are in the notice of sale. So it probably is a good idea for issuers to provide a few extra days. It's going to be very difficult to have underwriters receive documents on Friday for a Tuesday competitive sale, especially when they need to read and make sure they truly understand how the issue price rules and regulations are being met with provisions of the notice of sale. That's something else for issuers to take into consideration. Going back to the slide, while it's required in the different rules and required or mentioned to be required in the different guidance and documents that's been put together by NAVL and other groups, issuers should make sure they require a single point of contact with underwriters for purposes of determining this issue price for bond issues. That single point of contact should be the book running manager or the winning bidder. As other underwriters in the syndicate, again, the underwriters, anyone in the syndicate sells bonds, they're required to report the sale results to, the book running manager or the winning bidder or the manager of the syndicate. And we should be forcing that manager to be the sole point of contact as we as issuers need information about the issue price compliance. I've previously stressed about how the hold the price option will be pricey. There is a market risk there that will be passed along to issuers. through widening spreads. And then from state to state, we as state level issuers, I think have different duties with respect to issuers within our state boundaries. Here in Wisconsin, issuers within the state of Wisconsin can issue bonds. They don't come back through our office for approval. They don't come back through our office for review and consent. There's no reporting requirements. But we're well aware that there's many issuers in our state boundary that we see the results on bond buyer and other sources. There is a concern that the competitive sale exception may be a little challenging for smaller issuers to meet, specifically, getting at least 3 bids. Different data has been prepared by, individuals and organizations that, highlights that, in general, maybe up to 25% of competitive sales actually don't meet that 3 bid minimum threshold. So that's something that everyone should be concerned with, and what steps can be taken to make sure we do get 3 bids. As I was looking at, municipalities here in the state of Wisconsin that didn't meet that 3 bid threshold, I saw some big names, cities where, I thought it'd be more like sanitary districts or townships that would be the ones having problems getting 3 bids. Upon a little further research, the web that we're all in is that, the reason that there's fewer competitive bids for some of these issuers is, concerns with the issuer's compliance with their 15C212 undertaking, and that past miscompliance and, lack of reporting on miscompliance, results in underwriters not being able to submit bids to them on a competitive bid basis. Hence now we have a concern or an issue with meeting the 3 bid threshold from a competitive sale perspective. The last page of my presentation is just a summary of the resources, websites at SIFMA, websites at NABL that have documents that have been developed, for this. My information is listed at the bottom of the page. Others in the State Debt Management Network have been heavily involved with different organizations in preparing documents and information on this. Ellen Evans from the state of Washington, who's on the State Debt Management Network Executive Board, has been very active in this. Peg Henry, who consults State Debt Management Network from Stiefel, has also been heavily involved with this. So there's different people that have been working on this. Part of doing this presentation again today was the June 7th implementation date. But the other part, too, is that many of us are going to be together next week at the NASS Training Symposium. Feel free to contact any of us or meet up with any of us if you have questions or want to discuss this matter further. Again, from a state issuer's perspective, there's many ways that we can probably meet the intent of this rule, but that's in the current market, current situations, and this rule will be around for a long time. So obviously, we want to make sure we're prepared to address different situations, different markets that could make this rule compliance difficult, even for state-level issuers in the future. That's the end of my comments. I don't see any questions that have come in through the question box. I will turn the presentation back over to Jeremy.
All right, thank you, Dave. And I would just like to extend our thanks to all of our speakers here for helping to lead the discussion on this important topic. It's very interesting and informative and timely. And all of us at NASS and STMIN greatly appreciate the time and effort it took to prepare and meet with us. Just once again, with respect to today's webinar, please note that it was recorded and will be posted to the webinar archive on the NASS and STMN sites for future reference, along with the slides and the comment letter as well. So thank you all for participating, and I hope everyone has a great evening.